Have you ever come across a term that just sounds, well, huge and kind of intimidating? Like systematic theology. It definitely sounds like something you'd find in a dusty old library, right? But what if I told you it's really about building a home for your beliefs, a solid structure where everything has its place and it all just fits together? Well, today we're going to grab the blueprint for that home and see exactly how it's built. Let's get into it. So, here's our plan. First up, we'll break down what systematic theology actually is. Then, we'll put it on a map to see how it's different from other approaches. After that, we'll tackle the big question: why even bother building this system? And we'll wrap up by looking at the essential toolkit every theologian needs to get the job done. All right, let's start with a little thought experiment. Imagine someone hands you a collection of 66 ancient books. They were written by dozens of different people in different languages over hundreds and hundreds of years. You've got poetry, history, letters, prophecy, the whole shebang. Now here's the challenge. How in the world do you take all of that, all those different pieces, and build one single, coherent system of belief? That question, right there, is the fundamental problem that systematic theology was designed to solve. Okay, so let's jump into our first section. If the Bible is that giant library we just talked about, then you can think of systematic theology as the master blueprint for organizing it all. It's the plan that shows how every single room connects. You know, the term itself sounds way more complicated than it actually is. Let's just break it down. Theology comes from two Greek words, theos, which means God, and logos, which means discourse or word. So, boom, discourse about God. And systematic, that comes from sunestano, which means to organize or to make things stand together. So put them together, and what do you get? An organized discourse about God. It's really just about creating a tidy, logical structure for it all. The theologian Millard Erickson gives us this fantastic, really full definition. Let's unpack it for a second. He says it's about making a coherent statement. Based on the Bible, sure, and this is a big but, it doesn't stop there. He says it also has to make sense in our culture, be explained in language we actually use today, and, most importantly, it has to connect to the real issues we face in life. This is not supposed to be just some academic game.
So Erickson's definition basically gives us a recipe with 5 key ingredients. The first two are kind of obvious, right? It has to be biblical and it has to be systematic. But check out the last 3: relevant, contemporary, and practical. That's the real game changer. The whole point isn't to create some dusty museum of old beliefs. The goal is to build something that's actually useful for navigating the world we live in right now.
So let's move on. You know, sometimes the best way to understand what something is to first understand what it isn't. So we're going to draw a little map here and see where systematic theology fits in with its neighbors, because that'll show us what makes it so unique. Okay, think of it like this. Imagine all of Christian thought is a giant forest. Biblical theology is like a botanist who gets really into studying just one type of tree, say the oak trees in one specific valley. Historical theology, on the other hand, is like a historian studying how people's ideas about the forest have changed over centuries. But systematic theology, it's like climbing the tallest mountain around to get a satellite view of the entire forest at once, mapping out how every river, hill, and grove of trees all connect together into one big ecosystem. Okay, so we've got a handle on what it is and how it's different. But that brings us to the really big question. Why? I mean, why go through all this trouble to build such a complex system? Well, it turns out there are 3 really good, really practical reasons.
It all follows a pretty logical path. Step 1 is simply explanation. The Bible isn't laid out like a textbook, so this system helps create a clear, organized understanding of its core teachings. Step 2 is apologetics. This is about being able to give a reasoned defense of your beliefs when they're challenged. And step 3 is all about maturity. The idea is that a solid doctrinal foundation is absolutely essential for spiritual growth and for protecting yourself from bad ideas.
And that brings us to our final section, the theologian's toolkit. Look, if you're going to construct a massive intellectual building, you need 2 things, a set of ground rules and the right raw materials. So let's see what's in the box. These are basically the rules of construction. First, the non-negotiable starting point is belief in the inspiration of Scripture. Next, you need hermeneutical principles. That's just a fancy term for having consistent rules for how you interpret the text. Then the approach has to be inductive, meaning you build your conclusions from the text, not the other way around. You need objectivity and open mind. You also have to recognize progressive revelation, the idea that God's plan unfolds over time. And finally, there's what's called illumination, a belief that there's a divine element that helps with understanding. Okay, so what are the actual materials you're building with? Well, you have your primary sources. These are the bedrock, the foundation, the scriptures, and what's called general revelation, or what we can learn about God just from observing nature. Then you have your secondary sources. Think of these as your power tools. They're incredibly useful for the job. They include things like historical creeds, church tradition, and, of course, human reason. They're essential tools, but they always have to serve the primary sources. But even if you have the best rules and the best materials, there is one last absolutely crucial requirement: humility. The person doing the building has to constantly recognize their own limitations. We're talking about finite human beings trying to fully comprehend an infinite God. Complete, exhaustive understanding just isn't on the table. You have to be okay with that.
And that leaves us with this final, really powerful question. The goal, the ambition, is to build a perfect, coherent system of truth. But the builder, the human theologian, is inherently limited, flawed, and imperfect. So, how do you build a perfect system with imperfect knowledge? That's the fundamental tension, the ultimate challenge, and maybe the lifelong journey that lies at the very heart of systematic theology.